Hi guys, and welcome to our channel. My name's Imad and I'm a tutor at Study Buddies. We are an established education centre based in East London, providing quality after-school tuition to children ages 6 to 18, from primary school through to A-levels. We specialise in maths, English, sciences and 11 plus tutoring, providing small group and one-to-one classes from just £6.50 an hour. If you'd like to know more about us, then please visit our website at www.studybuddies.co.uk. You'll find our details on the screen. So today we're going to be looking at tenses and the distortion of time. Now, like narrative, tenses run throughout a text, and it can be very useful to comment on time when you're looking at any certain theme. Like narrative, they can be quite easy to spot, the tenses, if you understand what they are. The trickier thing is linking them to a certain theme or a certain meaning in the text. Now, there are 12 tenses in the English language. 4 of them go into past, 4 in present, and 4 in future. In my opinion, you don't need to know all 12 tenses, but it's pretty important to know what tense a sentence is written in, past, present, or future. As you have probably gone through the tenses in primary school, we're going to be focusing on how tenses serve as directions in the text. In a literary text, time doesn't flow in the same way as it does in our usual lives. For example, a character's whole life could be shortened down to about 300 pages, when in reality a person's life is much longer and more complex than that. If we look at how events are ordered in the text, we might find that a story begins perhaps near the middle or even the end of the plot. It might happen at a moment where all the action is, rather than at the very start of all the events in the plot. We might also want to consider where the text jumps in time. By this I mean that a character's life could be followed by the writer in the present, but then there might be something like a flashback or a story being told about a past event. In this sense, the text doesn't have to follow an ordered pattern of events when it comes to the plot. The writer can jumble up these events and create what is called a non-linear plot progression. This is quite useful in helping withhold some bits of information until the story develops, and then bringing it in maybe from the past or even from the future. This helps create suspense and also dramatizes certain elements of the plot. Now, we've talked about order in the text, but we can also consider how events are spaced in the text. Now, as we mentioned, a whole character's life can be reduced to about 200 pages, much shorter than a normal person's life. And this is because the writer can choose to skip over boring parts of the text, or parts that they don't think are relevant to the whole story. For instance, if the character goes to sleep at night, you expect the next event to be them waking up in the morning. It's unlikely that a writer will explain the whole sequence of events throughout the character's sleep period, because it's not going to be interesting to readers. Now, this might seem like stating the obvious, but when we start to understand the mechanics of time in a text, we can make some really useful analytical points that might just surprise the examiner. When we're looking at spacing, if we can consider where a boring scene might be skipped, even if it is stating the obvious, we can consider how 2 important events are joined, how the writer makes an effort to change time so that they don't lose the reader's attention. When we're looking at the progression of time in the text, we can also look at how the writer slows or speeds up time in a certain scene to create more or less suspense. For example, if the character is going on a long journey, the writer might choose not to be too heavy on the description, and this gives us a sense that time is speeding up so that we don't get bored by a long and tiresome journey. In the same way, in a really suspenseful scene, perhaps the last scene in a crime thriller, you might find that the writer uses a lot of description to build up our suspense until the final moment when everything's revealed. If you want to consider how fast or slow time is going through the text, you might want to pay attention to the length of the sentences, the amount of description that's being used, and the amount of dialogue that's being used. Generally, the more we're reading, the more we're associating a long period of time with the event that we're reading. If we have to read a short amount of words and lots of event being described in that short passage, then we assume that time is speeding faster, because we're comparing the events of the text with our own time. Finally, we can look at how the text is divided physically. If we know that when we're reading longer passages, we associate longer periods of time with them, we can also look at where there are gaps or lots of full stops in the text. If we have to pause while we're reading, there's a certain amount of time we're associating with that pause. We can also look at how the division of a text, perhaps into chapters, affects or marks certain transitions of time in the text. One really interesting thing to consider is where we as readers or as viewers of a play might pause while we're reading or watching. For example, in the theatre, you might have an interval taking place halfway through the play. That means that we go off and take a pause before we continue watching, especially before a really suspenseful event. We associate this pause with time going on, and so our perception of time influences our perception of the text. Now, this can often be described as a metatextual device, because it's linking our personal perception of the real world with the events that take place within a story. Ordering and spacing in the text can be quite easy to understand conceptually, but it can be harder to look at the text and specific sentences in the text and link them to how past, present, and future tenses are being used, and how there's a certain distortion of time that might be taking place. So let's look at an example, and we might consider what specific parts of a passage can be used to talk about tenses and the distortion of time. This is a passage from Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. It takes place where the monster is describing the event of his early life to his creator, Frankenstein. The passage reads as follows. We entered the hut, the fiend with an air of exultation, I with a heavy heart and depressed spirits. But I consented to listen, and seating myself by the fire, which my odious companion had lighted, he thus begun his tale. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. All the events of that period appeared confused and indistinct. It was dark when I awoke. I felt also, and half frightened, as it were, instinctively finding myself so desolate. I was a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing, but feeling pain invade me on all sides, I sat down and wept. You might want to take a second to pause here and consider the passage in light of what we've been talking about. So the use of tense, the transition of time, and also the ordering of events. Note that between the first and second paragraph there's a change in chapter. So these are my annotations of the passage. Before we go into the details, let's be sure on what's happening in the text. So in this first paragraph, we find that the monster and his creator, Victor Frankenstein, have gone into a cabin, and the monster is going to tell him how his life started as a story. The second part is the start of that story, where the monster awakes after being created and finds himself in darkness. As we can see in the yellow highlight, the past tense is being used first and foremost, and both Victor Frankenstein and his monster are referring to events taking place in the past tense. That's because they're both narrating from events that take place in the future after they're telling their stories. However, we can see where Shelley's marked a transition between one story and the next in the blue highlight, where the present tense is being used in I remember the original era of my being. A lot of writers use this just to show that the character is starting their story and it's a different story from the one that's been previously told. As you can see from the start of the second paragraph, I've highlighted the single quotation mark in purple because it shows that the monster's begun to speak. It also shows us that the narrator's changed and that it's not a continuation of Victor Frankenstein's narrative. If we look at how time is flowing through the text, you might notice that time is going faster in the first part than in the second part. This is a matter of opinion, but I think that it's all about showing how your viewpoint might be true. In my case, I found that in a couple of lines in the first paragraph, Victor's gone through entering the hut, talking about the monster and his own moods, and then sitting down, lighting the fire, and beginning the story. In contrast, the monster uses a lot more words to describe less events taking place. So he first shows that he's beginning a story, and then he's waking up, he's describing his moods, and then he sits down and weeps. This is about 4 events taking place, but I should mention that where I've put the ellipsis, the 3 full stops, I'm showing that I'm skipping a chunk, because in reality, this brief passage actually takes over half a page. Now, if we consider that the same number of events are happening in a short piece of text and a much longer piece of text, we might get a sense of how time moves much faster in the first part than in the second part. As I've mentioned, we can also look at the length of sentences to determine how fast or slow time is flowing. If you look at the last two sentences, lots of semicolons and commas are being used to join bits of information together and create really long sentences. In terms of description, we might notice that the monster takes a lot more time to describe his own thoughts and feelings than Victor, who uses about a sentence to describe the feelings of both him and the monster. Finally, let's look at how time jumps in the text. If you're familiar with Frankenstein's plot, you'll know that after the creation of the monster, his creator leaves for a long period of time after being horrified at what he's created. At this moment in time, they've met again, and the monster is beginning to describe his origin story, which has happened in the past. From this we can understand that from the first passage to the second, the plot is reversing back in time and skipping to an earlier event taking place. This is especially useful because Frankenstein doesn't detail what happens after the monster is created, as he wasn't there for that. So this second piece of information fills in the blank that was created by the writer earlier on in the story. The practical effect of this is that we start to understand the monster not just as a creature, but as a person in his own right. Mary Shelley could have skipped over this, but she decided to include it because it then turns the monster into something that resembles a human. This creates a lot more detail and a lot more depth in the story overall. So that's it for this week. We've taken a really brief glance at how time can be manipulated by a writer to create drama and to create suspense. I hope that the next time you read, you might find it a bit easier to pick out these subtle points in the text where time is changed or where time is flowing faster or slower. Next week we're going to be looking at alliteration and how sound is used in poetry to create certain effects in the text. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Stay tuned and I'll see you next week.